To this panel discussion entitled Stepping Toward the Abyss, Putin Brandishes Nuclear Weapons. I'm George Beebe. I'm Vice President and Director of Studies at the Center for the National Interest. With me today is a distinguished pair of experts. Dr. James Acton holds the Jessica T. Matthews Chair and is co-director of the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Cynthia Roberts is professor of political science at Hunter College. She's a senior research scholar at the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies at Columbia University. And in 2019, she served as a policy advisor on the joint staff at the Department of Defense. Neither Dr. Acton nor Dr. Roberts will be speaking as spokespersons for their respective institutions, but rather in their personal capacities. A reminder to our audience that you have at the bottom of your Zoom screen a Q&A icon, which you may use to submit questions that you would like me to pose to our panelists. I'm going to begin our discussion today by posing some questions of my own, and I wanted to start with Cynthia Roberts. Cynthia, we heard just a few days ago, as this crisis in Ukraine was unfolding, that President Putin in Russia had issued an order putting Russia's strategic nuclear forces on what was called a special regime of combat duty. Can you comment on what you know about what that might mean in particular? And also, can you talk a little bit about Russia's nuclear doctrine, and in particular, whether that doctrine provides for the possibility that Russia could use nuclear weapons in response to non-nuclear threats?
Okay, thanks for inviting me. And yes, I only speak for myself, not my university or any part of the US government. Obviously, I'm a professor. Clearly, we're back in a world that looks like more like the Cold War than the post-Cold War world. That world is now over. And I say that in the sense that in the Cold War, every conflict took place in the shadow, in the nuclear shadow, in the risk of nuclear war. I think that is also the case here. And now we see, and this started actually in 2014, and now we see more of it, that Putin and Russia is engaged in nuclear signaling. So the answer to your first question is distinguishing between nuclear signaling and actual nuclear threats. The nuclear signaling of this announcement of putting nuclear forces on a new combat regime is not one that I think most of us are familiar with in that actual terminology. But in exploring it, it seems to be ratcheting up the alert level, but not, as some journalists have reported, putting nuclear weapons on the highest alert. That is clearly, there's no evidence of this, and the intelligence officials, including Director Haynes, who was testifying just the other day, suggested they didn't find any discernible evidence. So mostly it involves increasing staffing, combat readiness in the sense of personnel. We also see evidence that the Russians are conducting standard drills, but this is a form of nuclear signaling to suggest a deterrence, especially to the United States and to NATO countries, to stay out of the war as opposed to a threat. We don't have, and that was why the intelligence testimony was so important. I haven't seen any indication of private communication of threats to the US, but of course that probably wouldn't be disclosed. This is still in the general realm of deterrence signaling. In terms of Russian doctrine, the standard Russian doctrine states very clearly that nuclear weapons would be used in response to either weapons of mass destruction being used against Russia or other kinds of weapons, including conventional weapons, or any kind of aggression against the Russian Federation when it poses a threat to the very existence of the state. And one question that's not entirely clear, we could come back to later, is does that also include the regime, or is it the Russian state? Then there's a whole body of not just the published doctrine of military doctrine of Russia, but statements, writings that informs doctrine, is not official doctrine, but some of these statements are particularly important for this crisis, and they have been elevated in 2017 in the naval doctrine that goes so far as to bring in concerns earlier expressed by Russian writers and Russian policymakers, including Patrushev, someone very close to Putin, that stated that the doctrine would include demonstrating the willingness and determination to employ force, including non-strategic nuclear weapons, the tactical and theater nuclear weapons, would strengthen deterrence in conditions of an escalating military conflict. So that particular component of Russian nuclear doctrine is certainly one of the most relevant in today's situation of Russian aggression against Ukraine. Let me just mention one other thing briefly. There's been a lot of attention in the United States in recent years to this idea of Russian escalation and its view and doctrine, the idea of escalation to de-escalate or escalation to win a war. The United States, or many observers in Washington, have interpreted this principally in one context, escalation to win, with the fear that Russia might attack, say, a Baltic state and attempt to culminate its victory by launching or signaling maybe the use of one or two nuclear weapons to deter further escalation and to stop the war then with Russian victory. But as much as that is a possible interpretation, indeed, there are Russian writings that make exactly those arguments in the larger body of doctrine. It's better to see escalation control in the larger sense of it could also be escalation to survive, to avoid defeat, and not just escalation to consolidate aggression, but escalation to avoid loss. And now we're seeing with the signaling, I think, the focus on escalation control for deterrence of a wider war. That seems to be the principal preoccupation of the Russians today.
Thanks, Cynthia. James, I want to ask you about an area of research that you've been engaged in for several years now that you call entanglement. What do you mean by that term? And what does it mean for this question of nuclear escalation? And I'll divide that escalation question into two parts. One is intentional escalation, along the lines that Cynthia has just been discussing, and inadvertent escalation. Can you comment on that?
Absolutely. Thanks, George. And I appreciate the invitation here today. When I talk about entanglement, I generally think about inadvertent escalation. So let me kind of repackage your question in a slightly different order and talk briefly about deliberate escalation, and then secondly about inadvertent escalation and entanglement. I worry more in this scenario about deliberate about deliberate escalation than I do about inadvertent escalation. In the specific scenario we're confronted with in Ukraine, I think the first thing to say is, for me at least, the meaning of Putin's nuclear threat, nuclear signal last week is actually pretty unclear, which is true of a lot of the history of nuclear signals, I should say. Before the war, he made a nuclear threat to try to deter NATO intervention. I think we are deterred from intervening. But actually on Sunday, when he announced this high combat alert, he linked it to sanctions and unfriendly behavior from the West, which if you take that literally, and it's actually quite difficult to take it literally, it's a compelling threat that says, lift sanctions or I'll nuke you, which is kind of, difficult to treat as credible. Alternatively, Ukraine could be the target for this threat as a way to try to signal to Ukraine, stop resisting or win nuke you, which I think is very unlikely to work against Ukraine. So, I think the meaning of Putin's threat is pretty unclear. I don't think it's going to work in part because it's actually not clear what, in his ideal world, he would want the Western Ukraine to do to comply with it. But I think, and we can hopefully have a chance to discuss this further later, I think if the war goes very badly for Putin, I think we're a long way from this point yet, but if the war goes very badly for Putin, it is not impossible, I think, that from his perspectives, the risks of using nuclear weapons, while very large, could be smaller to him than the risks of not using nuclear weapons. In terms of inadvertent escalation and entanglement, this is something that would concern me enormously if there was direct NATO involvement in this conflict. If there is a no-fly zone, which I should say I think the Biden administration quite sensibly has zero interest in doing, we would start to see direct NATO intervention and these kinds of pathways opening up. Entanglement describes the growing interactions between the nuclear and non-nuclear domains. They include things like non-nuclear threats to nuclear forces, non-nuclear threats to nuclear command and control capabilities, dual-use weapons. All of this, I think, creates the possibility of misperception that can lead one side to believe that the other side is planning to escalate or has not, that can lead one side to believe the other is planning to escalate or perhaps has escalated already, and in that way can catalyze inadvertent escalation. Let me give you one super practical example of how this could play out in practice. Russia is ringed by early warning radars, whose primary purpose is to detect an incoming nuclear strike from the United States against Russia. Those early warning radars, however, serve multiple functions. They are dual-use systems, including space situational awareness. That is, they detect Russian and US satellites so they know where they are. If Russia starts to attack US satellites in a conflict, which it has plenty of capability to do, the kind of thing I worry we might do is attack Russia's early warning radars with conventional weapons, because if Russia can't see the location of US satellites, it can't attack them. But from a Russian perspective, we've just attacked its strategic nuclear command and control system, which it might interpret as the precursor to US nuclear strike against Russia. So, that's a practical example of how this combination of a dual-use command and control system, in this case, Russian early warning radar, and this growing threat, these things are very vulnerable to US non-nuclear attack, to my mind, could create inadvertent escalation. As I say, I think that is very unlikely in a purely Russia-Ukraine scenario. It would become substantially more likely if there were direct NATO involvement.
Cynthia, do you want to?
I just want to go back to one point he started at the beginning, which is I also worry mostly about deliberate use and less so about inadvertent use, although there are sequences we can talk about that could lead to that. But in the case of deliberate use, I think it's least likely of a deliberate use against Ukraine, and actually more likely in the case of another country like Eastern flank country like Poland. And the reason is this: in the 60s, the Russians did a study of what it would be like to conduct military operations. In the General Staff did the study, presented it to the Politburo, what it would be like to conduct military operations according to plans that they then had in a nuclear environment. And they discovered it would be impossible. After 3 days, everybody would die. And this convinced them that it was not, their doctrine was just not viable. So if they're in the middle of still conducting war against Ukraine and fighting on the ground, to me, it's unthinkable that they would use a nuclear weapon against Ukraine. On the other hand, if we look at the threats that Putin has made, and his frame of reference now is completely different than it was a few weeks ago. He's already made this incredibly reckless decision to go to war, major war in Europe, and is suffering the non-kinetic consequences as the West has imposed the most extreme sanctions since those imposed on Japan before 1941. In this context, the threats he's made suggest, again, in signaling, still not direct ultimatum, but this signaling that any country that tries to stand in our way, or more so creates threats for our country, will have this consequences you've never seen in your history. And in the same statement that James referenced about the sanctions, and they have more than once said sanctions are an act of war and you should expect us to respond, and they haven't responded, which is interesting. And I do not think they would respond with nuclear weapons, but if they responded with cyber or something else, the nuclear weapons would be the deterrent for further escalation. But I think the no-fly zone issue they take very seriously, and maybe even beyond that. There are statements in the Russian military press you can find about the concern of how far the US and NATO countries will go in terms of supplying Ukraine. So the boundary lines for escalation in the minds of Putin and others in the Kremlin are not clear, but it suggests that this is at least something we should take very seriously.
Let me, George, if I can, let me just disagree slightly with Cynthia on one point there. I think it's certainly the case that large-scale battlefield use on Ukraine is unlikely, particularly for the reasons that Cynthia says. But I think one can imagine, for example, a demonstration shot over Ukraine. That's the kind of like Russian first use that I could envisage in this scenario. Somewhere remote, fairly low yield, not somewhere where Russian forces would necessarily be conducting large-scale operations, trying to send out the message that there is more to come at this point. Obviously, and I think implicit in the logic of using nuclear weapons on Ukraine would be Putin hoping that the US wouldn't respond. Obviously, Poland is covered by Article 5. Now, Putin still may hope the US doesn't respond, but I think the calculus would have to be that the US would be more likely to respond with a nuclear attack against a NATO state than a non-NATO state. The other very general point I would make here is I have no idea how constrained Putin actually feels by Russian doctrine on this occasion. I think this is probably true of a lot of national leaders in crises. One may have doctrine, one may have plans drawn up, one may have advice from the general staff, but I wouldn't be surprised if that is not particularly constraining for Putin in this kind of scenario.
Doctrine goes out. Yeah, no, absolutely. I completely agree with that. I did a study of, and I'm still working on this, on the difference between Russian doctrine of active defense, which goes all the way back in history, including before World War II. And then I actually got the Russian war plans from the 30s up to 41. And there are important departures there. And then, of course, how the high command fought the war involves other departures. Planning and war fighting and doctrine, are different things.
Right. Well, I think you might have anticipated some questions from our audience, which are beginning to come in. Joe Nye of Harvard University asked, I think, exactly about this question of a nuclear demonstration. He asked about exploding something over the Black Sea, someplace that it would not have quite so dramatic effect on the population centers, but might send a message. And he wants to know, does the nuclear taboo mean anything to Putin? Or are we dealing with somebody that has an entirely different frame of reference than anything we grew accustomed to during the Cold War?
So if you're asking me this question, I would say that, when you have started a major war, the psychological context becomes important. And also the framing that Putin used to launch this war, I think, has not gotten sufficient attention. I was rereading and teaching Bob Jervis's work on psychology and frames of reference. We miss him so much. And rereading his work is constantly a valuable exercise. But the idea that a policymaker or a leader can be acting rationally on the basis of the facts as they see them, but still informed by biases. And the frame that Putin was in when he launched this war, to my surprise, was 1941. And, here I am in the middle of a new paper coming out, another one in the works, arguing that the generals and the leaders learned the wrong lesson from 1941. And he's making the argument and I was told he made this to the general staff on the eve of the war as well, that the lesson they learned was they didn't do enough, they didn't act. Stalin's mistake was to be too passive and engage in appeasement, and they should have implemented the war plans, which were more offensive. And rallying the troops, we're going to go forward and prevent and demilitarize Ukraine and prevent the threat from coming here to Russia. So that's a frame of success. As the war continues, I don't know if they're there yet, but they may get there. He may go into a frame of losses where and be more open to taking higher risks. Evidently, Putin did not see this miscalculation, this gamble, this reckless move as one that would destroy everything in the future for the future of Russia, things that he himself had said he wanted to build. And it will also destroy the relationship, any positive relationship with Ukraine except subjugation. So I think that we're in a different frame, a different situation now, and it's difficult to talk about Putin's frame. We don't have enough information. I'm not sure they've concluded the war is going badly. They probably still believe they can win whichever of the war aims they pursue. They'll double down, engage in brutality, and that in turn may make it easier to use nuclear weapons. That's one of my fears. Remember how much strategic bombing the US engaged in World War II, and the cost, the enormous cost of that strategic bombing, which were actually higher, the conventional bombing against Japan, than killed more people than the two nuclear weapons did. Whether it made it easier for Harry Truman to make that decision, in addition to knowing the cost of a land invasion would have been against the main island of Japan, I don't know, but one doesn't want Putin in that same frame of reference.
Cynthia, you earlier referenced a different aspect of 1941, not Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union, but the sanctions regime against Imperial Japan. And on December 5th, 1941, the Japanese ambassador in Washington delivered a diplomatic note saying that his government considered the economic warfare that the United States was engaged in as even more threatening to Japan's survival than actual war, and that under the circumstances, Japan had no choice but to respond. And we all know what happened just a couple of days later at Pearl Harbor. Do you think that Putin would contemplate escalating ultimately to nuclear levels if he felt the Russian state were at risk of extinction simply by means of economic asphyxiation, if you want to call it that?
It's a very good question. I've asked myself. I never believed the sanctions would deter Russia, and they didn't. They can certainly punish Russia, and we haven't seen, as I said, sanctions this extreme, especially the ones on the Russian sovereign, on the central bank, and the unified attack, economic and financial attack. Deservingly, one could argue, against Russia, given their aggression against Ukraine. So it's hard to predict how Putin will react. I think they probably will be, and they already are surprised, seizing up the economy, making it impossible, or not completely impossible, but to convert rubles into dollars. It's severely limited their capacity and will have a dramatic impact on the Russian economy. So when that settles in, it's hard to know how the Kremlin, how Putin himself will react. It should be settling in now. They might still think they have a way to escape. It's interesting that the head of the central bank, a very capable economist who was able to buffer Russia for many years against sanctions and and especially in 2015, after the 2014 increase in sanctions, conduct a very strong and effective macroeconomic policy, tried to resign twice, was told she had to stay in her job. She had hoped to go off and work for the IMF, as I've heard, and now her life is completely ruined, as is the lives of any international-minded, liberal, intellectual, educator, business person, or anyone with an international life. Their lives have been completely upended, and they're, I imagine, all trying to leave or face a future of autarky and fortress Russia, where all of their future is closed to them. So this is a huge shock, and it may take a while to fully settle in. And then a lot will depend, I think, and here I totally agree with James, as the Russians double down with increased brutality against Ukraine, siege and bombing, the pressure on Western governments, including the United States, is going to grow to do something. And this is where the danger, I think James is right, of the unintended effects could happen. If something like a no-fly zone or some other actions, increased military support that the Kremlin sees as direct intervention at a time when we've destroyed their economy, the culminating point of crisis may lead to a frame of loss in Putin's mind, where he sees this as the kind of pressure, do something, or else it's all lost, or it's all lost and we're going to make them pay, so it's not just us that pay. This is how you can get a NATO country like Poland attacked, especially if they're in the forefront of pushing to try and do something to help the Ukrainian people. So it's not impossible to imagine that, hard as it might be.
George, I want to add to that. One thing to consider is the effect of the sanctions on Russia's economy. Another thing to consider is, does this war reach the point in Russia where Putin starts to seriously fear for his own hold on power? My assessment was we are a long way from that point today. I think a lot of people, myself included for that matter, saw the initial protests in Russia, kind of interpreted this as being widespread discontent. And polling we've seen, including from independent organizations like Levada, suggest the exact opposite. There is still a solid bedrock of support. So I'm not claiming we're at that point yet. But if this war drags on, if body bags get taken back into Russia by the thousands and tens of thousands, we know that Putin has spoken publicly at his, quote, disgust, unquote, at Gaddafi's killing in public. It seems to me he could, if we reach a point where he worries about his hold on power, long way from that point yet, and when he looks at Russia's economy and it's the devastation that sanctions might cause and a lack of a future there, at that point he could kind of say to himself, well, if I don't use nuclear weapons, I could end up like Gaddafi. If I do use nuclear weapons, maybe they help me get out of this. Like that's the kind of comparison of risks. And I think, I've kind of, one of the points I've made repeatedly over the past week or two, we need to provide Putin with an off-ramp here. We can't make him take it, but we can at least provide it with him. And in particular, we've sent very mixed messages in sanctions about whether we would lift them if Ukraine and Russia reach some kind of ceasefire and implement some kind of ceasefire agreement. You have on the one hand, Victoria Nuland, the Undersecretary of State, saying publicly to TASS that we are open to sanctions negotiations, sanctions relief in the framework of an end of war agreement. But you also have the French economics minister saying, literally declaring economic war on Russia. And plenty of opposition to any talk about lifting sanctions. So as I said, we can't make Putin walk down an off-ramp, but to my mind, we should make it very clear that the purpose of sanctions is to change Russian behavior. It's not to end Putin's regime. And if Zelensky can negotiate a peace agreement of some type with Putin, which Zelensky now says he wants to do and is open to compromises on various issues, if there is an agreement that is good enough for Zelensky, I believe it should be good enough for the US as well. And we should be prepared to, negotiate over what sanctions we would lift.
Can I just make one point about Putin's vulnerability? I I don't see Putin as vulnerable now. A lot would have to happen for a couple of very important reasons that need to be said. First of all, a strong personalist regime can survive a war loss, and a personalist autocrat can stay in power. We have good social science on that. He's not Gaddafi. He's not at risk. Secondly, Russia doesn't have any tradition of military coups. So it's not likely, even if the casualty rate increases, that there'll be a military coup. And let's remember, even with Khrushchev, the military participated, but it was led by the Politburo, which is the third reason. This is a personalist authoritarian regime, not a collective leadership. And that's bodes better in Putin's fate than it did for Khrushchev. And third, their level of repression is significantly higher than it was in 2014. People who would want to change the regime are trying to get out. The numbers are hard to detect now, but apparently a lot of Russians have left and are trying to leave the country. So who's left, right? Those who are stuck there. And then the information propaganda machine is in work. So they may not like what's happening. We may get mothers out on the street. I'd love to see the mothers out on the street as they did in Afghanistan. But it's very unlikely that's all of that's going to come together anytime soon. It would have to be the security forces around Putin cracking. They were apparently not enthusiastic about a war against Ukraine. But on the other hand, Russia reverting to fortress Russia, a strong Russia, is the Russia they wanted, right? They don't have the overseas bank accounts. They're prohibited from having property on the southern coast of France. So this is maybe not exactly the world they wanted, but it's closer to rewarding them. And that leaves Putin still in power. So, one can't predict these things, but I think it's less likely than more likely.
I see that Sergei Rogov has raised his hand in the audience. Sergei, if you would not mind putting your question into the question and answer icon, and then I can relay that to our panelists. I want to ask about a different period of history, Cuba, 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. One of the things that John Kennedy said was the most important lesson of the resolution of that crisis was that the leaders of nuclear superpowers should not put each other in a position where either one of them has to choose between losing face and launching a nuclear war. How would that lesson translate into the conditions that we're facing today? What ought we be doing to try to find a way out of this situation? And conversely, what should we make sure that we not do that might put either ourselves or the Russians in a position where they face that kind of dilemma?
Yeah, I think in ending the war, the primary actor here is not the US, it's Ukraine. Putin has, Russia has set out a series of conditions now for ending the war, which I actually interpret as a fairly significant shift. I mean, at the beginning of the war, the US, and I correctly interpreted Russia's aims as being maximalist. I mean, the subjugation of most of Ukraine, if not all of it. And now, Putin has set out, his spokesman Peskov has set out a series of conditions. Ukraine has to amend its constitution for neutrality. It has to recognize Crimea as Russian. It has to cede control over. It has to recognize LNR and DNR as independent states. There was an implication about disarmament, some kind of demilitarization of Ukraine. Zelensky has said that he's open to negotiating over a bunch of this stuff. I mean, he's made it clear. He said Ukraine can't recognize Crimea as Russian, but he's looking for a formula there. So I think a lot of this actually ending the war, this is a big difference from Cuba, in which the US was the primary actor with the Soviet Union. In the case of this particular crisis, a lot of the negotiation to end the war is going to have to be between Ukraine and Russia. And Ukraine is going to have to decide, Zelensky in particular, is going to have to decide what he's willing to do to preserve Ukraine as an independent state, to stop the slaughter of his people. And that potentially gives Putin something to go away with and claim he got, even if he fails in his primary goal of conquering all or most of Ukraine. We, the US, and the rest of the world, I think, have a role to play with that, as I've said earlier, in sanctions relief. I think if we are not prepared to lift sanctions, if Putin and Zelensky can reach an agreement, which I don't think is going to happen in the next few days or few weeks, but if they can reach an agreement, then I think we have a critical role to play in providing Russia with sanctions relief, because I find it very hard to see Russia reaching an agreement with Ukraine unless there is sanctions relief on the table. So I think the dynamics here are critically different from Cuba in the fact that, as I said, the US is not the primary player in negotiating the end of the war and deciding what, if Russia fails to take the whole of Ukraine, what Putin gets for face saving. That's actually, we can obviously talk to the Zelensky privately behind the scenes, but it's his country, so.
I think there are two important lessons from the Cuban Missile Crisis that are worth keeping in mind. One is Khrushchev was gambling, and his gamble was, as we know it, try and get the nuclear weapons into Cuba without detection. And if you get detected, retreat quickly, right? That was the idea. And they got there, but then they were detected and they were already there. So the first was an incredible gamble, but Khrushchev had an element of caution. And we saw the most important lesson that comes out of the Cuban Missile Crisis is that both leaders, both JFK and Khrushchev, were willing and interested in engaging in restraint to resolve the crisis as opposed to escalating it. This is really important. We see that now on the US side. The US is showing considerable evidence of restraint, canceling ICBM routine launches and so on, and testing, trying to avoid the no-fly zone, even though it would like to do something to help Ukraine. The US levels restraint. We don't see that on the Russian side. So we would need to see restraint coming from Moscow. The second important lesson, seems to me, from the Cuban Missile Crisis is incredible luck. I mean, if you dive deep into the details of the Cuban Missile Crisis, what you find is a horror show. The tactical nuclear weapons that were already there. Why wasn't the XCOM focusing on these tactical nuclear weapons and the risks they posed? We were incredibly lucky also that the Soviet captain of the submarine who wanted to launch the nuclear torpedo, that didn't happen. So in these kinds of nuclear crises, we need restraint by the leaders, and we also need to be lucky, and that's a kind of thin reed.
Question from the audience: what are the procedures to employ nuclear weapons? And I'm assuming this refers to on the Russian side of this equation. Would the Russian military refuse to launch? Can you envision a situation like that?
Not in the middle of a war. I can't imagine that. We know some things have been published about in the open source, and the DIA has provided some open information. There's some Russian sources that exist on the general launch procedures, how it would go through an order from the president. He doesn't actually push a button any more than the US president would push a button. Codes that would be released, how they would be delivered, and as well, and this is all in the strategic nuclear context, how as well they would go to the system, and a certain amount of redundancy in the communications, as well as this perimeter system of which appears to be, we don't know a lot about it, quasi-automatic that would allow Russia to launch. And their strategy is not quite for the strategic nuclear launch on warning. It's closer to launch under attack. translating it from the Russian is much closer to launch under attack. And the kind of automated system appears to be a capability that if the leadership was knocked out, they would still be able to launch. So those procedures would go through different channels, and presumably if any rogue military wanted to defeat it, it could be overruled. What we know less about, and what I know less about, don't feel we can answer, I can answer, is the procedures for non-strategic nuclear weapons. Obviously, they would have to start by doing something they haven't done. I should have mentioned in the first question about the alerting, we haven't seen signs of mating the warheads in storage with the weapon platforms, whether they're naval or air delivered or ground launched. That would be a really important signal to notice. And the fact we haven't seen that is why I said at the outset, I don't think we're interpreting this as high alert, but as a notch to signal. But then the communications would presumably be as standard theater commanders. It would go again from the president, who is the commander in chief in Russia, just as in the United States, and presumably to the theater, to the operational commanders, and then down. But again, this is why the Cuban Missile Crisis should be so alarming to us. What have we learned, or how have Russian launch procedures or command and control procedures evolved since then? Do tactical commanders have the ability to launch their missiles without full codes, right? I don't know the answer to that.
James, I want to ask you a related question on this. Many years ago, I believe it was back in 2013, the Defense Advisory Board here in the United States talked about the threat of cyber warfare and the kinds of potential steps that could be taken. And one of the things that they highlighted, as I recall, was the possibility that cyber activities could interfere in the ability of weapons to be launched when commanders say, let's press the button. Is there a danger that in this situation where there's a great deal of mistrust, a great deal of fear on both sides about what the other side's intentions are, that cyber intruders could venture into command and control systems and cause alarm on the part of either side about their ability to actually launch if they were to try?
Yeah, I think that there has to be some concern there. Before I kind of highlight what I think some of the risks are, I'd emphasize that with NATO's non-involvement in this conflict right now, or not direct military involvement, the risks of, again, escalation because of these kind of through these cyber pathways, I think are much more limited. But sure, I mean, the first thing to say is one doesn't this doesn't have to be third party. Cyber operators talk about preparing the cyber battlefield. You don't just, in the event of a crisis or a conflict, start trying to penetrate somebody else's networks. That's something you do in peacetime. Imagine that this crisis worsens and, there is more of a direct NATO-Russia element to this standoff. And then Russia discovers some kind of malware in its command and control system that the US put there 6 months ago, or a year ago, or 2 years ago. Russia wouldn't necessarily know when that malware was put there. That could look, that may have just been a kind of fairly routine peacetime thing for the US to have done that gets interpreted by Russia in an extremely hostile way. And again, don't forget, to the extent we understand this, a lot of these command and control systems are dual use. We know a lot less about the Russian command and control system than we do about the US one. But I have found references, for example, to Russian military writings, translated because I don't speak Russian, but Russian military writings that talk about how a particular Russian satellite constellation for communications is used for both nuclear and non-nuclear operations. So these kinds of either cyber espionage or preparations for potential cyber attacks in the future, may be directed against what, from the attacker's perspective, is a conventional non-nuclear target. But because it's dual use, the other side could interpret that as being nuclear. Another possibility here, for example, is that a third state or a non-state actor has somehow penetrated Russian or US or whoever's command and control networks. As I understand it, my impression is that we are getting a lot better at attribution, knowing who was the author of malware, but that's a time-consuming process. In a very fast-moving crisis, there may be a tendency, before attribution can be properly completed, to assume that your opponent in that crisis, the person you're standing off against, was the author of the malware, even if that's actually not the case. So again, I think this for me would become a lot more dangerous if we were in if there were direct NATO involvement in this conflict. But I think there are certainly ways, particularly inadvertently, that one can imagine cyber espionage being misinterpreted as attack, or confusion about who put malware in some network, or when that malware was put there. All of this kind of has some escalatory potential baked into it.
Another aspect of this whole crisis that's gotten a lot of attention in the past week involves not nuclear weapons, but nuclear power plants. And we all are familiar with the reports that Russian forces besieged and attacked a large nuclear power facility in Ukraine. A lot of concern that the Russians' attack on that facility was meant in some way to use the nuclear fuel there in some sort of threatening way. The Russians, on the other hand, have suggested that their concern was primarily to keep that facility out of the hands of Ukrainian extremists. Could you all comment on what we know about this and what kind of dangers there are that might be posed by peaceful nuclear power facilities in Ukraine?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the first thing to say is I'm by no means certain of what Russia's motives were in attacking, and I'm going to butcher the pronunciation here, I'm sure, but the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, which is the largest in Ukraine, and that was where we saw the firefight. I think it was last Friday, if I recall correctly. My sense is Russia seeks to control Ukrainian critical infrastructure. Being able to turn off electricity or being able to turn off for Ukraine's, it is a potent threat for Russia having control over Ukraine's electricity supply and being able to threaten to turn it off. So I don't believe that Russia was deliberately trying to cause a nuclear accident at that power plant. Like, if it wanted to, it could have done so without that much difficulty. I believe it was behaving exceptionally recklessly and dangerously in an effort to take over that power plant. I don't think the attack was inadvertent or accidental in that sense, but I don't think it was aimed at causing an accident. What I would say about nuclear safety in general, which is a kind of sideline of my research, it is a classic example of where the assumptions that go into making a nuclear reactor safe can break down catastrophically in a conflict. What I mean by that is, if a nuclear power plant switch is turned off, it has the fuel in the reactor core has to be cooled. And it gets energy from the grid to do that. If the grid connection gets knocked down, then you've got emergency diesel generators that can generate electricity on site. And basically the idea behind nuclear safety is it's very unlikely that a grid connection is knocked out. It's very unlikely that a diesel generator is knocked out. And the probability of both of those happening is unbelievably small. The problem with that is, if you have some huge event that hits the plant, like a tsunami as at Fukushima, all of these different layers of defense can be simultaneously overwhelmed. And that's true in a war situation as well. The failures of these different systems are not, the probability of these failures are highly correlated all of a sudden. They're not independent of one another. What we saw at Zaporizhia, and I was really scared for a couple of hours there, because you had a fire which appeared to be at the reactor. That turned out to be wrong. It wasn't. It was a training building. The fire service reportedly could not get there because they were being shot at. And if you have a fire you can't put out at a plant, all of a sudden, multiple different safety systems become threatened. And the worst case here, and I emphasize this is the worst case, this is not all that likely, but the worst case is a Fukushima-like accident.
So, but this is more evidence of recklessness and coercion and brutality. And it could get much worse. We're still in the scenario, I think, where the Russian military is pursuing gains and expects to achieve its political objectives, whatever that will be in terms of the subjugation of part or all of Ukraine or regime change in Ukraine, and so on and so forth. But if they achieve those, that's one outcome. If they start to face even more difficulties, and here in the US, there's much more focus on their difficulties than on their successes and their potential to still achieve military goals, will, I think, influence how much coercion they use. And my understanding, James, correct me if I'm wrong, is that this nuclear power plant powers more than just Ukraine. So there's Zaporozhye, that is, that it extends into Europe. And therefore, there are other coercive signaling going on here as well.
We're heading close to the end of our hour. I want to ask about the day after some kind of settlement. Let's put our optimist hats on for a minute here and imagine that the warring parties can find some sort of compromise that ends the immediate fighting. What do you think the implications are for dealing with the prospects of nuclear escalation in the future? We, had been up until a few months ago on a course toward trying to negotiate a successor regime to the New START treaty, trying to talk about strategic stability with the Russians, including some sort of cyber rules of the game. Can you envision a situation in which the United States, Russia, Europe, China, and others are moving towards some sort of new sets of understandings about how to stabilize the situation internationally? Or is that scenario more or less impossible under the circumstances that we might be facing in some sort of post-conflict environment?
I'm happy to take a first shot at that, Cynthia, if you.
No,
a few thoughts. I think a lot depends what happens in the conflict. Does Putin make a nuclear threat that terrifies the Ukrainians and forces them to accept a much worse deal than it looked like they were going to get? If that's the case, then I think that will underscore the value of nuclear weapons and potentially fuel further proliferation. Does Putin make a bunch of nuclear threats that have no discernible effect on anybody whatsoever? The conflict is ended without nuclear use in a way that Putin's nuclear weapons don't appear to have averted a bad outcome for Russia, right? If that's the case, I think the value of nuclear weapons would be slightly devalued by this conflict. In terms of kind of the possibility of future cooperation, is arms control part of a settlement agreement? I mean, the US and NATO put a bunch of suggestions to Russia in January in this negotiation. Russia expressed interest in one of them, which involved inspections at Aegis Ashore sites on a reciprocal basis. If Russia wants that as part of a face-saving solution to end the war, then as something that Putin can claim as a victory, then the outcome of this may boost arms control efforts. If it's not, it's obviously very hard to see the US and Russia talking and seriously negotiating. Though I'd add to that the odds of a New START extension, or sorry, a New START replacement at this point, we're looking pretty gloomy even before this war started. So I think a lot is very contingent upon what happens in the war. I'll also kind of wrap in, there was a question about the Budapest memorandum that came up. I would say this, it's not clear to me as a result. Sorry, let me start this answer in a slightly different place. There's no doubt in my mind that a lot of states have been heavily motivated by fear of a conventional attack and regime change to develop nuclear weapons. Like, I think that was absolutely, for example, part of Iran's motivation for developing nuclear weapons. It's Israel's motivation for developing nuclear weapons. The thing is, it's not entirely clear to me whether there's a non-nuclear weapon state out there that's has capability to develop nuclear weapons, who fears conventional attack much more as a result of this war. Clearly that's true of the, clearly the Baltic states and other NATO members are very, have this fairly deep fear of Russia. But, they're under the NATO umbrella. There is kind of an implicit understanding that if you get the US security umbrella, you don't go nuclear. There's extensive reinforcement now of NATO troops in Eastern Europe. All of that, I'm not massively worried about Estonia proliferating. If Ukraine wants another war against Russia, then the best thing it could do after this war is develop a nuclear weapons program, which, like, Putin invented a nuclear weapons program to justify this war. But I just don't think Ukraine is going to go and develop a nuclear weapons program. So, one could imagine a defeat by a catastrophic defeat by a nuclear power fueling proliferation. I'm just not convinced that this is the example of that.
I'm not that optimistic. Of course, the contingent question of how this ends will matter a lot. Will it end with some peace settlement sooner rather than later, and not the non-use of the actual use of nuclear weapons as opposed to just nuclear threats? But I think that this is going to lead us to redouble our questions about extended deterrence. The US has long had a view that extended deterrence required limited and flexible options. And I suspect that those who've made that argument will believe that this is an essential part of deterring Russian use of non-strategic nuclear weapons and ensuring extended deterrence. And that without them, to have to respond with strategic weapons would be unwise and unsound strategy. So I think that's going to deepen that argument, which is one that was being debated, of course, by the Biden administration that wanted to move to sole purpose and raise the question of no first use. I think that's going to all go away as the German sort of view on defense has gone away and changed basically overnight. One hopes Germany now contributing substantially to European security in a way that's been reluctant to do in the previous era, which has already ended. That post-Cold War era is over. I think the only optimistic thing I can say about this is that China now has to look at not just the concern of what might happen in a armed, forcible attempt to reincorporate Taiwan and the potential for escalation there. But I think China now sees much more clearly that the weapon of the dollar and the dollar system that could be used against it, not just by the United States, but by all allies unified, is a much more powerful weapon than maybe they thought before. And this changes the universe in some respects for China. And this is a good thing because now, sanctions didn't save and won't save Ukraine, and they could even provoke escalation, not necessarily nuclear, but other forms. But sanctions in the future could well have an important impact in information, reducing the information asymmetry about Taiwan, because now the Chinese see this is a very serious weapon. On the nuclear issue, of course, we had arms control in the Cold War, and we could in some way have that in the future. One would hope that we would be able to negotiate those kinds of common interests and stability. But I don't think it's going to happen right away. And I think instead we're going to be focused on the other use. And countries that do have security concerns, that don't have nuclear weapons, may be more encouraged to get them. And I agree with James, it may be a small set, but that will be the lesson they will interpret. And for the record, we should make it very clear, there are no Nazis in Ukraine and there were no nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And this is not a legitimate casus belli.
Well, on that happy note, I will draw our discussion to a conclusion. Thank you to our panelists for a very insightful, albeit somewhat terrifying discussion. Thank you to our audience for a great set of questions, and we'll all look forward to the next event at the Center for the National Interest. Thank you.
Thank you.